Phaedo is the name of a person who was there with Socrates the day that he died. And so this work called the Phaedo is a description of those last few hours of the life of Socrates. And Socrates is surrounded by friends, and the friends are getting concerned about him dying. And they've already resolved the fact that he's going to stay, he's not going to flee. That was resolved in the Phaedo. But they do have concerns about what's going to happen to him. And so Plato describes this lengthy conversation. Now, in the Phaedo, we have a lot of epistemology and metaphysics from Plato. And at the beginning, we have a rehearsing of the existence and the nature of Platonic forms. And we have an argument there for the existence of the Platonic forms through imperfection. And so the pagination, of course, is as standard numbers there that you typically find in the margins of any text. And this occurs at 74 through 76. And Plato is basing this argument on the imperfection of our experiences and the imperfection of objects that we experience. We make judgments about objects that we sense with our physical senses, but those objects are imperfect. So the objects we perceive with our senses are merely imperfect approximations of the forms, or partially represent aspects of certain forms. And the forms, however, are perfect, not imperfect like we sense. And so the argument that's given here in this section concerns the concept of equality, but it could be referencing any other concept that Plato discusses as having a form, such as a square, or beauty, or justice, or health, or strength, or even the form of the good, both morally and metaphysically speaking. And so we have this sensory experiences, and let's see how the argument goes. So we use the form of the equal, capital E, equality. Now we perceive two objects to be equal, say two pens or two coins, or Plato uses sticks or stones. But when we declare them to be equal, we recognize that the objects only approximate equality. They fall short of being perfectly equal. So with two quarters, for example, you can see a flaw in one that is not on the other. And so in a sense, Plato says they are both F and not F. They have this quality and they lack the quality. They're equal, but they're not quite equal. So that's similar to the kinds of claims that Heraclitus made about physical objects that we're familiar with through our physical senses. And so to understand that two things are only approximately equal, one has to have in mind perfect equality, the equality that the imperfectly equal things fall short of. We have to have a standard in order to declare that they don't meet the standard. And the standard is the equality, capital E, right? We must have in mind something that is perfectly equal in order to make a judgment that two things are equal, but not really perfectly equal. So we have to have that standard in mind. And so there must be something that exists that is perfectly equal that we have in mind in such cases. Now, we can recall the arguments of Parmenides here. If you have something in mind, then the thing has to exist for it to be something that you can contemplate. Now, we had some criticisms of the argument, but here Plato is making use of that kind of reasoning, but he's not using it exactly like Parmenides did. He says we have this standard in mind, so the standard has to exist. Perfect equality exists. So Therefore, equality, capital E, equality itself, the form of equality exists, and that is distinct from any sensible objects. So there is a form of equality. Now, like I said, this could be applied to all kinds of other things. So this not only gets us the form of equality, but forms in general. Now, why is that relevant to the issue? He's just about to die. He's in the last few hours of his life, and here he's giving arguments for the forms. Well, the forms exist in a separate realm, this realm that's separate from our sensory perception, and yet we're aware of their existence. How? Due to our pre-existent souls. So we must have acquired the knowledge of something like perfect equality prior to birth. We have it. We couldn't have acquired it with our sensory experiences of things that are imperfect. So we had to have had it even prior to our birth. And so what happens is we recover our previous knowledge when we're exposed to sensations. And Socrates proposes the existence of the forms as the best way to explain our knowledge. And what learning is really nothing other than recollection. We saw this rehearsed in the Meno, and how Socrates uses triangles and how to make, and squares rather. The squares was the one he used with the slave, and how to make a square twice the size of another square. And he shows that the slave actually knew that, even though he was never taught mathematics. And so what he was doing was recalling something that he knew prior to birth. So if learning is a process of recalling knowledge that we did have prior to birth, then the soul must have existed prior to birth. And that means that the soul is immortal. So Socrates is comforting his friends and saying, look, you've accepted the existence of forms, you've accepted my teachings on how one learns, that it's really recollection, and we have to have an immortal soul in order for those things to make sense. So let's continue to pursue this idea of the forms and how it's relevant here to the topic. Okay, so let's think of the forms this time. Let's just consider one like right triangularity, the ones that Pythagoras was thinking of. So the concept of a right triangle is something that's not grasped by the senses, but by the mind. And the concept is much more stable than the things we perceive. And speaking of triangles, of course, that should remind us of Pythagoras. And we have the Pythagorean theorem. And Pythagoras concluded from this that there's this separate realm, the realm of the invisible, and that is eternal. It is more real than that which is visible and passing and fading. And so how Plato describes this, he kind of unifies the ideas of Heraclitus and that of Parmenides. Heraclitus, who says everything's always in flux, Parmenides, who said nothing ever changes, and Socrates, through Plato here, is saying they're both right. Heraclitus is right about the visible realm. Parmenides is right about the invisible realm. And things are in flux in the sensible realm constantly, like Heraclitus described. Things change. Nothing comes into existence or goes out of existence, though, in the invisible realm. Right? Parmenides is right about that. So, to which realm does the soul belong? The soul is simple, and it belongs to the invisible realm, which means it doesn't change. It is eternal. And so death is not so bad. The soul will continue to live on. The soul is most like the divine. The characteristics of the soul include it's intelligible, it's indissoluble, it's deathless, it's uniform, it's not composite. In other words, it's not made of parts, and so it's simple. And if it's not made of parts, it can't decay, right? Things that are made of parts, the parts can be separated, it can be destroyed, it can be decayed, but a soul doesn't have parts like that. It's part of it's in the invisible realm. It's simple, so it's not going to decay. So Socrates is going to continue to live even after his body is put to death. So in contrast, right, the body's a composite, has parts, it's destructible, it's unintelligible because we can't get a clear grip on it, and it's changeable. So the soul is in the invisible realm, simple, and is indestructible. The body, in contrast, is composite and destructible. And so there's no real need to fear death. The soul is going to continue to live on, even though the body is going to decay. Now, a little trivia here on some other ideas that Socrates had about the soul. He says that after death, the souls of gluttons and drunks are going to be in the company of donkeys. That's where they're going to go hang out. And those of war and fighting, right? Those are going to be among wolves and hawks, the predators, right? Because they're not ready for their soul to be separated from a body of some kind. Now, the souls of philosophers, they are ready to be separated from the body, and so they're going to be among the gods. Their souls are prepared to be released from the body, and so that's the end of philosophers. And the more attached one is to pleasures and pains of the body, the more the soul is united to the body. Plato uses the term riveted to the body. And so it's going to more quickly return to a body. So someone who's a glutton or a warmonger, they're going to return to some body or another, and they're not going to be released to go on to exist in the invisible realm with the gods. And Plato warns, especially violent pain welds the soul to the body even more so. And likewise with pleasures, especially he calls these violent pleasures, they put the soul into the body, they connect the soul to the body more closely. So one might think that Socrates was a complete ascetic who denied any pleasures. Now, in some sense, there are stories about him that seems to be the case, but we do have at least the fact that he has children means that he at least had sex some of the time. So that's, I assume, the kind of violent pleasure he might have been talking about. But in any case, the goal for a philosopher, says Socrates, is to be separated from the body, so that you can go on and continue to do philosophy, right? So Socrates' circumstances, he says, they're due to my benefit, right? That I'm soon going to be in a better place. I'm going to be able to ponder the forms directly and not be bogged down by this body that I have. And broadly speaking, he says, those who practice philosophy are preparing themselves for death. What they're doing is they're separating their soul from their body. They're contemplating things of the eternal realm. And that helps them prepare to have a complete separation. So it would be wrong for a philosopher to shun death, to try to avoid it. And even as a little philosophy humor there, he talks about how the broad view in the majority of people think that philosophers are nearly dead, and they are thought to deserve to be dead. And Socrates kind of says, yeah, that's true. That is what we deserve, so that we can contemplate the forms more directly and do philosophy without being inhibited by our physical senses. So death for Socrates is a separation from the soul and the body. Of course, the body just decays, but the soul goes on. And doing philosophy, that practice of doing philosophy, separates the soul from bodily concerns. And Socrates says, if this is what I've been doing all my life, if we're trying to comprehend the nature of reality, we've got to free ourselves from bodily constraints. And so that's what's going to allow reasoning to take place. This is my goal all along. So why should I fear death? This is what I want. Now, in part two, we'll continue to look at the arguments because some of his friends raise some arguments that maybe Socrates is wrong about the soul. And so Socrates responds to those arguments, and that's what's in part two.